A strange discovery near one of history's most famous royal tombs may reveal that the story of King Tut is not as complete as we once believed. What if one of the most famous tombs ever discovered was never meant to tell us the whole story? Deep beneath the golden sands of Egypt, near the resting place of a young pharaoh who became a legend almost overnight, archaeologists continue to encounter clues that refuse to fit neatly into the story we thought we understood. Tutankhamun's tomb has already revealed gold, mummies, weapons, chariots, jewelry, and objects that survived for more than 3,000 years. Yet the deeper researchers look at the Valley of the Kings, the more questions seem to emerge. Now, reports and interpretations surrounding unusual objects and structural features near the royal burial complex are once again drawing attention to a possibility that has haunted Egyptologists for decades. Could there be something beneath the surface that has escaped discovery? Could the story of Tutankhamun contain a hidden chapter, sealed away from the modern world? And if another chamber or forgotten space were ever found, what would it tell us about the mysterious people who prepared this young king for eternity? When Howard Carter first entered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he stepped into a world that had remained almost completely untouched for thousands of years. The discovery was unlike anything archaeology had seen before. Inside were objects of extraordinary beauty and enormous historical value, arranged around the burial of a pharaoh who had ruled Egypt for only a short time. At the center of the chamber was the image that would become one of the most recognizable faces in archaeology: the golden death mask of Tutankhamun. Its polished surface, dark blue inlay, and carefully shaped features created the impression of a ruler frozen forever in gold. But even this famous object has generated questions. Was it originally created specifically for Tutankhamun? Were some of its elements reused from an earlier royal burial? Why does certain evidence suggest that parts of the mask may have had another identity before being associated with the young king? These questions are not proof of a secret conspiracy. They are part of a much larger archaeological puzzle surrounding Tutankhamun's short and unusual reign. Tutankhamun became pharaoh as a child, during a period when Egypt was recovering from enormous religious and political changes. His predecessor, Akhenaten, had attempted to transform Egyptian religious life by elevating the worship of the Aten above the traditional pantheon of gods. Temples were abandoned, old religious traditions were challenged, and Egypt's political landscape was transformed. Then suddenly, the old order returned. Tutankhamun restored the traditional gods and moved the royal court away from Akhenaten's controversial capital. His reign was brief, and his death came when he was still very young. Even today, historians continue to debate exactly what caused it. His tomb creates another mystery. Compared with the enormous burial complexes prepared for some other pharaohs, Tutankhamun's tomb is surprisingly modest. Its chambers are small. Its layout is unusual, and some researchers have proposed that it may originally have been intended for someone else before being adapted for the young king. That possibility becomes even more intriguing when researchers examine the surrounding rock and the architecture of the Valley of the Kings. Over the years, scientists have used radar scanning, geological surveys, digital mapping, and other technologies to search for hidden spaces beneath the ancient landscape. Some investigations have produced intriguing signals, while others have failed to confirm earlier claims. The debate over possible hidden chambers has therefore remained unresolved. And this is where the mystery becomes more fascinating. Because archaeology is not simply about finding treasure. It's about reconstructing a vanished world from fragments. A wall can reveal how people lived. A broken tool can reveal what they valued. A burial object can reveal what they believed would happen after death. And sometimes a tiny artifact can raise a question larger than the object itself. Imagine discovering something near a royal tomb that does not immediately match the objects already known from the site. Its design seems unfamiliar. Its original purpose is uncertain. It may belong to a different period, a different workshop, or perhaps a completely different stage of the tomb's history. At first, such an object might appear insignificant. But archaeology has taught us that the smallest clues can sometimes change an entire interpretation. A strange artifact near Tutankhamun's burial site would not automatically prove the existence of a hidden chamber. It would not prove a lost dynasty. It would not confirm every theory that has appeared in books and documentaries. But it could force researchers to ask a new question. Why was it there? Was it placed during Tutankhamun's burial? Was it moved from an older structure? Did later workers disturb the area? Could it belong to someone connected to the royal family whose story has been lost? And perhaps most importantly, what else remains beneath the ground? For thousands of years, the Valley of the Kings was not simply a cemetery. It was a carefully constructed landscape of death, religion, power, and memory. Pharaohs believed that their existence continued beyond the physical world, and their tombs were designed to help them enter eternity. Every corridor had meaning. Every object could have a purpose. Every inscription could carry a message to the gods. That is why an archaeological anomaly can be so important. It may represent nothing more than an ordinary construction feature, a later disturbance, or a misplaced artifact. But until the evidence is properly examined, the possibility remains open. And Egypt is full of such unanswered questions. There are tombs whose owners remain unknown. There are chambers whose original functions are debated. There are inscriptions whose meanings are still incomplete. There are royal burials that were robbed in antiquity, leaving historians to reconstruct what once existed from scattered fragments. Tutankhamun's tomb survived largely by accident. Its entrance was eventually hidden beneath debris, protecting it from some of the ancient tomb robbers who had devastated other royal burials. For centuries, the young pharaoh remained almost invisible to the modern world. Then Carter's discovery changed everything. The treasures of Tutankhamun became symbols of ancient Egypt itself. Yet perhaps the greatest discovery was not the gold. It was the realization that history can survive in unexpected places. A sealed doorway, a damaged inscription, a fragment of wood, a forgotten burial object, a strange shape beneath the floor. These are the pieces from which lost stories are rebuilt. And somewhere beneath the desert, there may still be pieces waiting to be found. The mystery surrounding Tutankhamun also reminds us of something uncomfortable. The ancient world was not a simple story of magnificent monuments and powerful kings. Behind every golden artifact were workers, priests, craftsmen, families, soldiers, political rivals, and ordinary people whose names disappeared from history. The pharaoh's mask survived. His tomb survived. His name survived. But thousands of others did not. That is why every unexplained discovery carries a strange weight. It may offer a voice to someone who has been silent for thousands of years. And if future excavations reveal another chamber near Tutankhamun's tomb, the most important question may not be what treasure lies inside. It may be whose story has been waiting there. Because the deeper archaeologists dig into Egypt's past, the less certain the boundaries of that past become. A tomb that once seemed like a complete story can suddenly become the first page of another mystery. And Tutankhamun may be only the beginning. Beyond the golden mask, beyond the sealed chambers, beyond the legends that have grown around the Valley of the Kings, hundreds of other mysteries remain scattered across the world. Some were hidden beneath deserts. Some disappeared inside ancient cities. Some were buried with the dead. And some were preserved only as stories whispered from one generation to the next. A legendary city beneath the ruins of Troy. A mysterious tablet created to curse an enemy. Bodies hidden deep inside abandoned mines. Ancient people whose rituals seem almost impossible to understand today. These are not stories from a single civilization. They are fragments of a much larger human mystery. And as we leave the silent tomb of Tutankhamun behind, we enter a world where legend and archaeology begin to collide. Because sometimes the strangest mysteries are not the ones that have no evidence. They are the ones where the evidence exists, but refuses to tell us the whole story. The story of ancient Troy, begins with a question that has survived for thousands of years. Was the legendary city described in Homer's epic poetry a real place? Or was it simply a magnificent story created from fragments of older traditions? For centuries, the Trojan War existed somewhere between mythology and history. There was the famous city, the beautiful Helen, the wrath of Achilles, the wooden horse, and an army that supposedly fought for years beneath the walls of Troy. To later generations, these stories seemed too extraordinary to be true. But then archaeologists began digging. On a hill in modern-day Turkey, layers of ancient settlement slowly emerged from beneath the soil. Walls, streets, pottery, weapons, and traces of destruction revealed that this was not an imaginary city. A settlement had existed here for thousands of years, and different civilizations had built over the remains of those who came before them. The site became associated with ancient Troy. Yet archaeology immediately created another mystery. Finding a real city does not prove that every event described by Homer actually happened. The ruins contain evidence of destruction, rebuilding, trade, warfare, and changing cultures. But they do not provide a simple answer to the question of whether the Trojan War unfolded exactly as the ancient poem describes it. The deeper archaeologists excavated, however, the more fascinating the story became. The city had been destroyed and rebuilt many times. Different layers represented different periods, almost like pages in a book written over thousands of years. Somewhere among those layers might have been the historical event that inspired the legend. Or perhaps there were several events gradually transformed by generations of storytellers into one enormous tale. This possibility changes the way we look at mythology. Ancient legends were not necessarily created from nothing. They could preserve memories of real places, forgotten conflicts, natural disasters, migrations, and political struggles. Over centuries, those memories could become exaggerated, combined, and transformed into stories filled with gods and heroes. And Troy may be one of the most famous examples. According to the ancient epic tradition, the Greeks sailed across the Aegean Sea and laid siege to Troy after Paris, a prince of Troy, carried away Helen, the wife of the Greek king Menelaus. The conflict supposedly lasted for years, until the Greeks finally abandoned their apparent assault and left behind a massive wooden horse. The Trojans brought the horse inside their city. That night, Greek soldiers hidden within it emerged, opened the gates, and allowed the waiting army to enter. Troy fell. It is one of the most famous stories in human literature. But did a wooden horse really exist? Some researchers have suggested that the story may have been inspired by something very different. Perhaps the horse was a symbolic representation of a siege machine. Perhaps it referred to a ship whose decoration resembled a horse. Others have proposed that the story developed entirely through poetic tradition. There is no archaeological evidence that can definitively prove the existence of Homer's wooden horse. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes the mystery endure. Ancient civilizations often used symbols that were connected to religion, warfare, and political power. The horse itself was an important animal in the ancient Mediterranean world, associated with strength, mobility, warfare, and prestige. So when ancient storytellers spoke of a giant wooden horse, they may have been describing something that audiences of their time understood in a way we no longer do. Then there are the physical remains of Troy itself. Excavations have uncovered enormous defensive walls, gateways, buildings, pottery, and evidence of long-distance trade. Some layers contain signs of violent destruction. Fires appear in certain archaeological levels, and human activity suggests that at least one phase of the city ended in turmoil. But destruction alone cannot prove the Trojan War. Ancient cities were destroyed for countless reasons. Earthquakes could collapse walls. Rival armies could attack. Political instability could tear a kingdom apart. Even accidental fires could transform an entire settlement. The challenge for archaeologists is separating coincidence from evidence. And sometimes, that distinction is nearly impossible. This is where another mysterious object enters the story. Ancient artifacts connected to Troy have inspired claims that the epic tradition may contain more historical memory than previously believed. Stories have circulated about objects, inscriptions, and supposed offerings that appear to correspond with details found in ancient Greek literature. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A genuine artifact with an ancient inscription can tell us what people believed or recorded. It can reveal names, religious practices, languages, and political relationships. But it cannot automatically prove an entire legendary narrative. Still, every authentic discovery changes the possibilities. Imagine standing among the ruins of Troy as the sun begins to disappear behind the hills. The stones around you are not merely ruins. They are remnants of a city that existed through generations of war, trade, religion, migration, and political transformation. Thousands of years ago, people walked these same streets. They built homes. They worshipped gods. They buried their dead. They feared enemies beyond the walls. And somewhere within this ancient landscape, a story may have been born that would eventually become one of humanity's most famous legends. Perhaps a real war inspired the tale. Perhaps several wars were combined into one. Perhaps the wooden horse was a metaphor that later generations misunderstood. Or perhaps the truth is hidden somewhere in the archaeological layers still waiting to be explored. The mystery of Troy demonstrates a fundamental problem with studying the distant past. We rarely receive the complete story. Instead, we inherit fragments. A broken wall, a burned layer, a piece of pottery, a weapon, a burial, a line of poetry preserved for centuries. Researchers then attempt to reconstruct an entire civilization from these scattered clues. Sometimes the result is remarkably accurate. Sometimes it is completely wrong. And sometimes, the truth exists somewhere between history and legend. The same pattern appears again and again across the ancient world. A story survives because people remember it. The details change. The names become larger. Heroes become almost superhuman. Ordinary events become supernatural. And eventually, thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover the place where the original memory may have begun. Troy is therefore more than a mystery about a wooden horse. It is a mystery about memory itself. How much of the past can survive inside a story? How many generations can preserve a historical event before mythology changes it beyond recognition? And if the Trojan War was based on a real conflict, what actually happened behind those ancient walls? Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Troy existed. We know that it did. The real mystery is what happened there. And just as the ruins of Troy force us to look beneath the surface of an ancient legend, other discoveries around the world reveal something even darker. Some mysteries are preserved in temples and royal tombs. Others are buried where no one expected to find them. Deep beneath the earth, abandoned mines have become the final resting places of people whose stories were never meant to be remembered. And in one such story, the boundary between tragedy and legend becomes disturbingly thin. A missing miner, a forgotten promise, a dream that supposedly revealed the location of a hidden body, and a mine that, according to local tradition, was never truly silent again. Because sometimes, when the dead disappear without explanation, the living create stories to fill the silence. And those stories can survive long after the evidence has vanished. There are places where the past does not feel buried. It feels trapped. Deep beneath the ground, inside abandoned tunnels and forgotten shafts, the darkness seems to preserve more than rocks and minerals. It preserves stories. Stories of workers who entered the earth and never returned. Stories of accidents that were hidden, forgotten, or explained away. And sometimes, stories of voices that people claim can still be heard long after the last miner has gone. In the early 19th century, one such story emerged from the gold mines of North Carolina, where greed, death, and a mysterious disappearance became woven together into one of the region's darkest legends. The story centers on a mine owner remembered in local tradition as Skinflint McIntosh, a man whose reputation was built around an obsession with wealth. According to the tale, safety was never as important to him as profit. The deeper his workers went into the earth, the greater the danger became. But the gold mattered more. One of the miners was a man named Joe McGee. Before beginning his work, Joe reportedly asked the mine owner for financial protection for his wife. He wanted some form of insurance in case he was killed in an accident underground. Skinflint agreed, and according to the story, promised to pay even more than the amount originally requested. Then Joe disappeared. There was no dramatic warning, no confirmed collapse witnessed by his companions, no clear trail leading out of the mine. He simply vanished. His family searched. Friends searched. The mine was examined. Yet there was no obvious evidence of what had happened. Joe's wife eventually demanded the money that had been promised to her. But the mine owner refused responsibility, insisting that Joe had simply left. The mystery might have ended there if not for an extraordinary story that followed. One of Joe's closest friends reportedly had a dream. In that dream, Joe appeared to him and explained that he had been killed underground after a support beam failed. More disturbing still, the dead miner supposedly revealed the exact location where his body had been buried beneath the collapsed earth. When the friend awoke, he remembered the location. The following day, he led others into the mine. According to the legend, they found Joe's remains exactly where the dream had indicated. For the people who heard the story, this was more than a coincidence. It was a message from the dead. The mine owner was eventually forced to honor his promise, and from that moment, the story took on a life of its own. People began to say that Joe's spirit had never left the mine. At night, strange sounds were supposedly heard rising from the underground passages. Some described them as weeping. Others spoke of unexplained noises deep inside the tunnels. And slowly, the mine became associated with the idea of a restless spirit warning others about the consequences of greed. Whether any supernatural event actually occurred is impossible to establish from the surviving story. There is no reliable evidence proving that Joe's ghost returned from the dead. But there is something important hidden inside this legend. It reflects a reality that existed in mining communities everywhere. Underground work was dangerous. Support structures could fail. Workers could be trapped. Explosions, falls, flooding, and toxic gases could kill people without warning. For families, the mine was both a source of income and a source of fear. And when someone disappeared underground, the absence of a clear explanation could easily become the foundation for a haunting. The deeper we look into mining history, the more examples we find of folklore emerging from real danger. A strange sound in a tunnel could be caused by shifting rock. A distant knocking could come from underground pressure. A sudden collapse could occur after workers heard noises they did not understand. But for miners surrounded by darkness, every unexplained sound carried meaning. And sometimes, that meaning became a story. Yet the Skinflint mine legend is only one example of a darker question. What happens when the dead are not buried properly? Across history, mass graves have appeared after wars, political violence, epidemics, disasters, and periods of social collapse. Unlike ordinary cemeteries, mass graves often erase individual identities. Names disappear, stories disappear. People become numbers. And centuries later, archaeologists may uncover the evidence without knowing exactly what happened. One discovery in Zimbabwe became particularly disturbing because the remains were found inside an abandoned gold mine. The site reportedly contained hundreds of human remains, creating an image that was both archaeological and deeply unsettling. At first, the discovery raised enormous questions about when these people had died and why their bodies had been placed together. Were they victims of violence? Were they connected to political conflict? Were they minors? Could disease or some other catastrophe explain the deaths? The mystery became even more complicated as researchers attempted to establish the age of the remains. Claims surrounding the site have sometimes been presented dramatically, with suggestions of political killings and secret purges. But archaeological investigations require caution. Establishing the exact circumstances of death is extremely difficult, especially when remains have been disturbed, mixed together, or exposed to environmental changes. Bones can reveal trauma. They can reveal disease. They can sometimes reveal age, sex, diet, and patterns of physical stress. But they do not always tell us who ordered a killing, why it happened, or what occurred in the final moments of a person's life. That is where archaeology meets history. And sometimes history is deeply uncomfortable. A mass grave is not simply an archaeological feature. It is a place where individual lives ended. Every skeleton belonged to someone. Someone had a name. Someone had family. Someone had memories. Someone expected to wake up the next morning. When hundreds of bodies are discovered together, the scale of the tragedy can become overwhelming. The temptation is to immediately create a dramatic explanation. But the real work is slower. Scientists must establish dates. Researchers must identify the remains. Investigators must examine trauma. Historical records must be compared with physical evidence. Only then can a responsible picture begin to emerge. And even after all of that, some questions may remain unanswered. That uncertainty is one of the most haunting aspects of archaeology. The Earth preserves evidence, but it does not preserve explanations. A skeleton can survive thousands of years while the identity of the person is completely forgotten. A collapsed tunnel can preserve the location of a disaster while hiding the circumstances that caused it. A mass grave can reveal that people died together without telling us why. And sometimes, the silence surrounding a discovery becomes part of the mystery itself. This is why places like old mines continue to fascinate us. They exist between the physical and psychological worlds. They are real spaces carved into the earth, but generations of fear and storytelling have transformed them into something more. The darkness becomes a character. The tunnels become a maze. The silence becomes threatening. And every unexplained sound seems to suggest that someone, or something, may still be down there. But perhaps the most frightening truth is simpler. We do not need ghosts to make these places terrifying. Human beings are capable of creating tragedies that are far more disturbing than any legend. Greed can put workers in unsafe conditions. Political violence can erase entire families. Neglect can turn an ordinary workplace into a grave. And when the victims are forgotten, the silence becomes even darker. Perhaps that is why legends like the haunted gold mine survive. They transform a tragedy into a warning. The ghost becomes a symbol. The mine becomes a monument. And the story reminds every generation that there are consequences when human life is treated as less valuable than wealth. Yet beneath the earth, there are mysteries even older than these tragedies. In places far from modern mines, archaeologists have discovered something equally unsettling. Ancient human remains deliberately altered, rearranged, and combined. Skulls that do not belong to the same bodies. Bones from different individuals assembled into a single form. Mummies that appear almost like ancient puzzles. And the question becomes even more disturbing. Why would anyone do this? Was it a ritual? A spiritual practice? A way of honoring ancestors? Or was there another reason that has disappeared from human memory? The answer may be buried with the dead. And perhaps that is the most chilling thought of all. Sometimes the earth gives us the remains, but it keeps the reason. Imagine standing in the silent darkness beneath the sands of ancient Egypt, where every stone seems to remember a secret. For thousands of years, the tombs of kings have guarded their stories, sealed behind walls, gold, and layers of forgotten history. But what happens when archaeologists uncover something that was never supposed to be there? Something that does not fit neatly into the world we thought we understood. Near the burial site of King Tutankhamun, a strange object has raised questions that reach far beyond one tomb. Was it an ordinary artifact whose purpose has simply been forgotten? Or could it be a clue to a hidden chapter of Egyptian history that has remained buried for centuries? And if one discovery can challenge what we think we know about Tutankhamun, what else might still be waiting beneath the ancient world? The story begins in the shadow of one of archaeology's most famous discoveries. When Howard Carter entered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he was not simply opening another royal burial chamber. He was stepping into a world that had remained largely untouched for more than 3,000 years. Behind the sealed entrance were treasures that would become symbols of ancient Egypt itself. Chariots, jewelry, ceremonial objects, weapons, statues, furniture, and above all, the golden death mask of the young pharaoh. The discovery transformed archaeology, but it also created a problem. The more researchers studied the tomb, the more questions appeared. Tutankhamun was not one of Egypt's most powerful rulers. He ruled for only a short period, and his reign came during a turbulent chapter of Egyptian history. The religious revolution of his predecessor, Akhenaten, had disrupted centuries of tradition. Temples had been closed. Old gods had been pushed aside. The capital had moved. And after Akhenaten's death, Egypt began reversing many of those changes. Tutankhamun became the symbol of that restoration. Yet his tomb does not feel like the grand burial place we might expect for a pharaoh. It is unusually small compared with the monumental tombs of earlier rulers. Its decoration is limited. Some objects appear to have been created for someone else and later adapted for Tutankhamun. Even the famous golden mask has generated questions about its original identity and construction. The tomb planned specifically for Tutankhamun? Or was it prepared in a hurry because the young king died unexpectedly? That question leads us deeper into the mystery. For years, researchers have debated whether hidden spaces might exist beyond the known chambers of the tomb. One theory suggested that undiscovered rooms could lie behind the decorated walls, perhaps connected to another royal burial or an earlier phase of the tomb's construction. The idea captured the public imagination. Imagine a sealed doorway hidden behind thousands of years of paint and stone. Imagine opening it and finding objects belonging to another member of Egypt's royal family. Imagine discovering a burial that could completely change our understanding of the period. But archaeology does not operate on imagination alone. Every anomaly must be tested. Every unusual wall must be examined. Every object must be placed within its archaeological context. And that is where strange discoveries become particularly fascinating. An object found near a royal burial site does not automatically mean it belonged to the pharaoh. It could have been placed there during construction, reused from an older structure, moved by ancient workers, deposited during a later period, or even disconnected from the tomb entirely. Yet sometimes, an object refuses to fit. Its shape may be unusual. Its material may be unexpected. Its purpose may remain uncertain. And when that object is discovered in a place already surrounded by unanswered questions, even a small artifact can become enormously significant. This is where the mystery surrounding the strange object near Tutankhamun's burial site begins. At first glance, it may appear insignificant. But archaeology has repeatedly shown that history can hide inside the smallest objects. A broken seal can reveal who controlled a building. A fragment of pottery can reveal trade routes. A single inscription can change the identity of an entire structure. And an object whose purpose has been forgotten can sometimes tell us more about the past than an object whose meaning is obvious. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with preservation. The Egyptians built tombs to protect the dead. They placed objects beside the deceased because they believed these objects could serve a purpose in the afterlife. Food, clothing, furniture, weapons, jewelry, religious symbols, and ceremonial equipment could all become part of a burial. But not every object had a simple explanation. Some were deeply symbolic. Some represented gods. Others protected the deceased from supernatural dangers. And some may have served practical functions that have been lost to time. That is why the strange artifact becomes so intriguing. If its design does not immediately correspond to known objects from the area, researchers must ask a series of difficult questions. Who made it? When was it made? Was it created during Tutankhamun's reign? Could it have belonged to an earlier generation? Was it reused? And perhaps most importantly, why was it there? The answers could potentially connect the object to the complicated royal history surrounding Tutankhamun. The young pharaoh lived during a period when Egypt was struggling to restore its traditional religious and political order. His court inherited the consequences of Akhenaten's revolution, and many royal objects from this period appear to have been modified, repurposed, or reassigned. That means an artifact found near Tutankhamun's burial environment may not tell a single story. It could contain layers of history, one layer belonging to its original creator, another belonging to the people who reused it, and another belonging to the workers who placed it inside the tomb. This is one of the reasons ancient sites are so difficult to interpret. They are not frozen moments in time. They are more like archaeological palimpsests, where different generations leave their marks on the same place. The tomb of Tutankhamun is a perfect example. The famous treasures have been photographed countless times, but behind their beauty lies a complicated history of construction, reuse, restoration, and political change. Even the Golden Death Mask, perhaps the most recognizable artifact from ancient Egypt, has been surrounded by questions about its original purpose. Some researchers have suggested that parts of the mask may have been created for another royal individual before being adapted for Tutankhamun. If true, this would fit a broader pattern. A young king dies. His burial must be completed quickly. Objects originally intended for someone else are modified. A smaller tomb is used. And centuries later, archaeologists uncover a royal burial that appears both extraordinarily rich and strangely improvised. But there is another possibility. Perhaps what looks unusual to modern eyes was completely normal to ancient Egyptians. Perhaps the object near the tomb is not evidence of a secret chamber, a forgotten king, or an unknown technology. Perhaps its purpose was obvious to the people who lived 3,000 years ago. And that possibility may be even more unsettling, because it reminds us how much knowledge can disappear. Civilizations leave behind buildings, statues, tools, and inscriptions. But understanding does not always survive with them. A person can hold an object in their hands every day, understand exactly what it does, and never imagine that thousands of years later someone will find it and ask what it was for. That is how ordinary objects become mysteries. And this is why the discovery near Tutankhamun matters. Not necessarily because it proves something extraordinary, but because it exposes the limits of what we currently know. The ancient world was far more complex than the simplified images often presented in documentaries and textbooks. There were rival political factions, changing religions, forgotten craftsmen, unknown rituals, objects that traveled across generations. and people whose names were never recorded. Behind every famous pharaoh were thousands of ordinary individuals whose lives remain almost invisible. The workers who carved the tomb, the artisans who shaped the gold, the priests who performed ceremonies, the scribes who recorded offerings, the servants who prepared the burial, and perhaps someone who created the strange object that now raises questions. We may never know that person's name, but the artifact survived. It crossed centuries of darkness. And now, under modern scientific investigation, it has become another piece in one of history's greatest puzzles. The mystery is not simply whether Tutankhamun's tomb contains something hidden. The deeper mystery is how much of Tutankhamun's world has already been lost. Perhaps there are no secret chambers. Perhaps there is no forgotten treasure. Perhaps there is no supernatural explanation. And yet the silence surrounding the tomb remains powerful, because every unanswered question leaves open the possibility of another discovery. A sealed room, an overlooked inscription, a forgotten burial, a strange object beneath the sand, or a piece of evidence that forces historians to rewrite a chapter they believed was already finished. For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun's story was buried. Then, in 1922, the world heard his name again. Now archaeology continues to ask whether there is more to that story than the golden mask, the treasure, and the young king whose death remains surrounded by questions. Perhaps the strangest discovery is not what archaeologists have already found. Perhaps it is what they have not found yet. And somewhere beneath the ancient landscape of Egypt, behind stones that have survived kings, wars, and civilizations, another secret may still be waiting. Silent, sealed, and completely unaware that one day, someone may finally come looking for it. What if some of the darkest mysteries in human history were not hidden in forgotten legends, but buried beneath places where thousands of people once lived, worked, fought, and died? Archaeology can uncover extraordinary objects, but sometimes the most disturbing discoveries are not treasures at all. They are human remains. A skull placed where it should not be. A mass grave with no names. A body buried in a way that makes no sense. These discoveries force us to confront a side of the past that monuments and museums often leave out. Because civilizations were not built only by kings and inventors. They were also shaped by violence, fear, sacrifice, punishment, disease, and desperate attempts to survive. And when the ground finally gives up its secrets, the evidence can be more frightening than any legend. In one of the most haunting archaeological discoveries of Northern Europe, researchers uncovered evidence that completely changed the way we understand prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Thousands of years ago, a landscape in what is now Sweden looked very different from today. A lake covered the region, surrounded by forests and inhabited by communities that lived through hunting, fishing, and gathering. These people left behind few permanent structures. They did not build pyramids or enormous stone temples, but they did leave something behind: human skulls. Archaeologists discovered remains at the bottom of what had once been a shallow lake. At first, the bones seemed like the remains of an ordinary prehistoric burial. But closer examination revealed something much stranger. Several skulls showed evidence that they had been deliberately mounted on wooden stakes. Some still contained fragments of wood. The discovery was disturbing because it suggested that these were not ordinary burials. The people who lived here had deliberately manipulated the bodies of the dead. Some skulls showed signs of severe injuries. Others appeared to have been treated differently after death. The evidence suggested that the bodies had undergone a complicated ritual process before being placed in the watery environment. But why? That is where the mystery becomes impossible to answer with certainty. Archaeologists can examine bones. They can date material. They can identify injuries. They can reconstruct how objects were positioned, but they cannot ask the people who performed the ritual what it meant. And without written records, interpretation becomes a careful process of probability rather than certainty. Perhaps the skulls belonged to enemies. Perhaps they were displayed as warnings. Perhaps the ritual was connected to ancestors. Or perhaps the lake itself held religious significance. Whatever the explanation, the discovery reveals something important. Prehistoric societies were not simply primitive communities struggling to survive. They had complex social systems, beliefs, rituals, and ideas about death. The treatment of the human body could communicate identity, power, fear, or spiritual meaning. And this discovery is not isolated. Across the ancient world, archaeologists have repeatedly found evidence that human beings developed complicated relationships with death. Sometimes the dead were buried carefully with jewelry, weapons, food, or ceremonial objects. Sometimes bodies were cremated. Sometimes they were placed in caves. And sometimes the remains were manipulated long after death. These practices may appear horrifying to us, but to the people who performed them, they may have represented protection, respect, transformation, or even a way of maintaining contact with the dead. The past is full of rituals that seem strange only because we no longer understand the world in which they were performed. But there are discoveries where the mystery becomes even darker. In Belgium, inside the Goyet cave, researchers uncovered evidence associated with Neanderthals. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as primitive relatives of modern humans, almost like an evolutionary dead end. But archaeology has gradually destroyed that simplistic image. We now know Neanderthals created tools, used fire, cared for members of their communities, and possessed sophisticated behaviors. Yet the remains from Goyet reveal another side of their existence. Bones displayed marks consistent with cutting, breaking, and processing. Some bones had been fractured in ways that allowed marrow to be extracted. And in some cases, human remains appear to have been used as raw material for tools. The evidence has been interpreted as possible cannibalism. But even here, archaeologists must be cautious. Cannibalism can happen for different reasons. It can be driven by extreme starvation. It can occur during conflict, or it can have ritual significance. The bones alone cannot always tell us which explanation is correct. Imagine living tens of thousands of years ago. There are no supermarkets, no stored grain reserves, no modern medicine, no reliable transportation. If winter lasts longer than expected, animals disappear and food becomes scarce. If a hunting expedition fails, hunger can become a reality within days. In such conditions, survival could force people into decisions that would be unimaginable today. And this is what makes the archaeological evidence so powerful. It does not simply tell us that Neanderthals may have consumed human flesh. It gives us a glimpse into the extreme conditions under which prehistoric humans and their relatives sometimes lived. But perhaps the most disturbing question is not whether they practiced cannibalism. It is whether they saw it as disturbing at all. Human morality is not identical across time. What one culture considers sacred, another may consider forbidden. What one society sees as an honorable burial might appear terrifying to another. Archaeology constantly reminds us of this uncomfortable truth. Our modern assumptions cannot always be projected backward onto ancient societies. And then there are mass graves. Unlike ritual burials, mass graves often raise questions about violence on a completely different scale. In different parts of the world, archaeologists have uncovered pits containing dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of individuals. Sometimes the cause of death is obvious. Sometimes it is not. Bones may reveal injuries from weapons. Some remains may show signs of disease. Others may have been buried without ceremony, suggesting a crisis that overwhelmed the normal customs of society. But perhaps the most disturbing cases are those where the identity of the victims remains unknown. Who were they? Why were they killed? Who buried them? And why did no written record survive? A mass grave is more than an archaeological site. It is a place where individual lives have been reduced to anonymous remains. Each skeleton once belonged to someone who had a family, a name, a voice, and a story. Yet centuries later, only bones remain. Sometimes archaeology can restore part of that identity. Modern techniques can determine age. They can sometimes estimate sex. Scientists can examine trauma. DNA can reveal relationships. Isotopes can provide clues about where people grew up or what they ate. But even the most advanced technology has limits. We may discover where someone came from without discovering why they died. We may determine their age without knowing their name. And we may reconstruct a violent event without ever understanding the emotions of those who experienced it. That is why archaeology can be both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It does not simply reveal beautiful artifacts. It reveals consequences. The consequences of war. The consequences of hunger. The consequences of political conflict. And sometimes the consequences of beliefs that demanded unimaginable sacrifices. Ancient societies also created objects intended to protect people from supernatural forces. One extraordinary example comes from Roman-era Jerusalem. Archaeologists discovered an ancient curse tablet hidden beneath the ruins of a Roman villa. The tablet was associated with a woman who called upon supernatural powers against another individual during a dispute. What makes the artifact fascinating is the mixture of religious traditions represented within the inscription. Instead of relying on a single divine tradition, the curse appears to invoke multiple supernatural figures and magical concepts. Instead of relying on a single divine tradition, the curse appears to invoke multiple supernatural figures and magical concepts. To a modern observer, this may seem like superstition. But to the person who created it, the tablet may have represented a genuine attempt to influence reality. This tells us something profound about ancient societies. People did not separate daily life into the neat categories we use today. Religion, medicine, law, magic, politics, and personal relationships could overlap. A legal dispute might lead someone to seek supernatural assistance. A burial might serve both practical and spiritual purposes. A tool might have a practical function while also carrying religious symbolism. And an object found near a tomb might have a purpose that modern researchers can only guess at. This is why every archaeological discovery must be treated like a piece of a much larger puzzle. One artifact rarely provides the entire answer. Instead, researchers compare it with inscriptions, architecture, burial practices, material composition, and similar discoveries from other sites. Sometimes the pieces fit. Sometimes they contradict each other. And sometimes they create an even bigger mystery. The most dangerous mistake is assuming that every unanswered question must have an extraordinary explanation. Not every strange artifact came from an unknown civilization. Not every unexplained structure was built by a lost superculture. And not every ancient mystery requires supernatural forces. Sometimes the real explanation is simply that we have forgotten how ordinary ancient people lived. But that does not make the mystery less fascinating. In fact, it may make it more important. Because the deeper archaeologists dig, the clearer one truth becomes. Human history is not a straight line. It is a vast collection of forgotten experiments, beliefs, disasters, discoveries, conflicts, and survival stories. Some were recorded, many were not. And beneath our feet, countless chapters remain sealed inside the earth. The skulls mounted on stakes, the bones bearing traces of ancient violence, the cursed tablet, the anonymous mass graves, Each discovery gives us another fragment. But the full picture remains incomplete. And perhaps that is what makes these mysteries so haunting. We are not simply looking into the past. We are looking into lives that disappeared without leaving enough evidence to explain themselves. For every mystery archaeologists solve, another question seems to rise from the darkness. And somewhere beneath an ancient settlement, inside a forgotten cave, or beneath the foundations of a civilization we thought we understood, another discovery may already be waiting. Waiting silently. Waiting patiently. Waiting for someone to uncover the evidence and ask the one question that has followed humanity through every generation. What really happened here? What if the ancient world was far more technologically sophisticated than we have been led to believe? Not because ancient people possessed machines from another planet, or because some forgotten civilization had technology identical to ours, but because they understood the world around them with a level of intelligence we often underestimate. Long before modern factories, computers, and laboratories, humans were already experimenting with engineering, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, materials, and mechanical devices. They observed nature, learned from failure, and transformed simple materials into tools that could change the course of their lives. And sometimes, archaeologists uncover objects that force us to look again at what ancient people were actually capable of. One of the most remarkable examples comes from prehistoric Europe. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, long before the pyramids of Egypt rose above the desert, Neanderthals were living across parts of Europe. For generations, popular culture portrayed them as primitive, slow, and barely capable of surviving. But archaeological discoveries have painted a very different picture. They were skilled hunters. They understood fire. They made tools. They adapted to changing environments. And they were capable of planning. Then researchers uncovered something that revealed just how sophisticated their thinking could be. A wooden throwing stick, believed to be roughly 300,000 years old, was discovered in what is now Germany. At first, it might look like nothing more than a curved piece of ancient wood. But its shape tells another story. The wood had been carefully selected and deliberately modified. Its dimensions were not random. Its shape was not accidental. Someone had transformed a natural branch into a weapon designed to move through the air. That requires knowledge. The maker needed to understand how the object would behave when thrown. Too heavy, and it would be difficult to launch. Too light, and it might lack the necessary impact. The wrong shape could make it unstable. But the finished object was designed to spin and travel through the air with enough force to strike prey. This is an important reminder. Technology does not begin with metal. It begins with observation. A person watches a bird fly. They watch a stone fall. They see a branch bend. They notice that certain shapes travel farther than others. Then they experiment. That process is technology, and it existed long before written history. The throwing stick may have been useful for hunting birds and small animals, demonstrating that Neanderthals were capable of developing specialized weapons suited to particular environments. But the object also tells us something about their minds. Creating a specialized projectile requires planning beyond the immediate moment. The maker must imagine a result that does not yet exist. They must select material, shape it, test it, perhaps modify it, and then teach others how to use it. That chain of knowledge can survive for generations. It is one of the foundations of civilization. And this is where the mystery of ancient technology becomes even more fascinating. Because when we examine the ancient world carefully, sophisticated engineering appears again and again. The ancient Greeks, for example, developed mechanical devices that seem surprisingly advanced for their time. One of them was the water clock. Today, we measure time with atomic clocks and electronic devices. But thousands of years ago, people had to find ways to measure time without electricity. The Greeks developed systems in which water flowed at a controlled rate. As the water level changed, it could indicate the passage of time. This simple principle could be used for practical purposes. In some places, water clocks were used to regulate speeches and legal proceedings. Imagine standing in an ancient courtroom. There is no digital timer, no smartphone, no clock on the wall. Instead, a carefully constructed device measures the amount of time available to each speaker. A stream of water becomes a judge of time. It is easy to underestimate how ingenious this was. The challenge was not simply measuring time. The challenge was making the flow predictable enough to produce useful measurements. Ancient engineers had to understand containers, water levels, pressure, and mechanical movement. They were solving problems that still exist in modern engineering. Then there was another invention, the odometer, a device designed to measure distance traveled. According to ancient descriptions, mechanical systems could record the distance covered by a vehicle using wheels and gears. Every rotation represented a certain distance. This meant engineers could measure roads more systematically. Again, the principle seems simple. But simple ideas can require extraordinary ingenuity when there are no modern instruments available. These inventions challenge the idea that technological progress is always linear. We often imagine history as a ladder. Stone tools, bronze tools, iron, machines, electricity, computers. But reality is much more complicated. Ancient people sometimes developed remarkable technologies, lost them, rediscovered them, and improved them again. Knowledge can disappear. Civilizations collapse. Libraries burn. Workshops are abandoned. Engineers die without passing on their skills. And when that happens, technology can vanish almost completely. This possibility has inspired another controversial question. Could an advanced civilization have existed before modern humans? The idea sounds like science fiction, but scientists have actually discussed a more serious version of the question. What would happen if an industrial civilization existed millions of years ago and then disappeared? Would we still find evidence of it? This thought experiment has been called the Silurian hypothesis. The purpose is not to claim that such a civilization existed. Instead, it asks whether geological processes could erase the physical evidence of an ancient industrial society. Imagine a civilization disappearing tomorrow. Its buildings would begin to collapse. Metal would corrode. Roads would crack. Concrete would break apart. Vegetation would cover cities. After thousands of years, much of the surface evidence would already be damaged. After millions of years, tectonic activity, erosion, volcanic eruptions, glaciation, and sedimentation could destroy or bury enormous amounts of material. That does not prove that ancient industrial civilizations existed. There is currently no credible archaeological evidence for such a civilization before humans. But the thought experiment reveals something fascinating. The geological record is incomplete. What survives is not necessarily what was most important. It is what happened to survive. A wooden structure can disappear. A stone structure can collapse. A metal object can corrode. A biological material can decompose. And a civilization can leave behind almost nothing recognizable. This is why archaeology must constantly resist the temptation to assume that absence of evidence automatically means evidence of absence. But the opposite is equally important. An unexplained object is not automatically evidence of an advanced, lost civilization. The responsible question is always, what does the evidence actually show? That distinction becomes critical when we encounter mysterious ancient structures. Take the enormous megalithic monuments scattered across the world. Some stones weigh many tons. Others were transported over remarkable distances. Their construction required organization, labor, engineering, and planning. To modern eyes, these monuments can appear impossible. But impossibility often disappears once we understand the techniques available to ancient people. Levers, ramps, ropes, wooden rollers, counterweights, human coordination. None of these technologies require modern machinery. They require knowledge. And knowledge is often more powerful than raw strength. The ancient Egyptians understood this. Their monuments were not built by magic. They were built through mathematics, logistics, skilled craftsmanship, and enormous human effort. Yet even with these explanations, some ancient engineering achievements remain difficult to reconstruct in detail. We may know that something was built. We may know approximately when. We may even know what it was used for. But we do not always know exactly how every step was performed. That gap between what we know and what we can prove is where mystery survives. Another extraordinary example comes from ancient Mesopotamia. The Babylonians developed mathematical systems capable of sophisticated calculations involving astronomy, geometry, and measurement. Their writing preserved numerical information that reveals a society deeply interested in predicting celestial events. To us, the night sky is something we can study with telescopes and satellites. For ancient observers, the same sky was a vast mystery. But they watched it relentlessly. They recorded the movements of planets. They tracked eclipses. They developed calendars. They recognized patterns. And over generations, those observations became accumulated knowledge. This is one of humanity's oldest technologies. Memory transformed into data. Observation transformed into prediction. And prediction transformed into power. The ability to anticipate the movements of the heavens could influence agriculture, religious ceremonies, political decisions, and navigation. It is easy to imagine ancient technology as crude because it did not look like ours. But technology is not defined by appearance. A bronze instrument may be technologically sophisticated. A wooden device may be technologically sophisticated. A carefully engineered irrigation system may be more impressive than a machine made from metal. The real question is whether an object demonstrates controlled knowledge of the physical world. And again, archaeology answers yes. Ancient humans were experimenters. They were engineers. They were observers. They were problem solvers. They were not simply waiting for modern civilization to teach them how to think. They were the ones who began the process. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not whether ancient people had technology from some unknown source, but how quickly human intelligence learned to transform the natural world. From a sharpened stone to a spinning projectile. From a clay tablet to complex mathematics. From flowing water to a clock. From a rotating wheel to a distance measuring machine. Each invention began with someone asking a question. Can this be improved? Can this be measured? Can this move faster? Can this go farther? Can this problem be solved? Those questions created civilization. And thousands of years later, archaeologists are still discovering the answers our ancestors left behind. But for every ancient invention we understand, countless others have disappeared. The workshop is gone. The maker is forgotten. The instructions were never written down. The object survives alone, waiting for someone to recognize what it was meant to do. And somewhere beneath layers of earth, there may still be tools capable of changing our understanding of prehistoric intelligence. Not because they came from another world, but because they came from our own. From people who lived in a world without electricity, engines, or computers, yet looked at nature and saw possibilities. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not how advanced ancient humans became. Perhaps it is how much knowledge they developed that we have yet to rediscover. What if the stories we call myths were never meant to be taken literally, yet still contained fragments of real events? Across history, Humans have transformed disasters, battles, strange natural phenomena, and unexplained encounters into legends. Over generations, details changed, names became symbols, and ordinary events became extraordinary stories. But sometimes archaeology discovers something that seems to echo an ancient tale so closely that the boundary between myth and history becomes difficult to see. One of the most famous examples is the legendary city of Troy and the mysterious wooden horse said to have brought about its destruction. For centuries, the Trojan War existed somewhere between poetry and history. Then archaeologists began uncovering the remains of a real ancient city beneath the hills of modern Turkey. And suddenly, an old question returned with greater force. If Troy was real, how much of the story was real too? For thousands of years, the story survived through the words attributed to Homer. The Iliad describes a brutal conflict between Greeks and Trojans, a war driven by honor, revenge, alliances, and the legendary figure of Helen. At the center of the story stands Troy, a powerful city surrounded by massive defenses. The Greeks besiege it. Years pass. The war appears impossible to win. Then comes the deception. The Greeks construct a gigantic wooden horse. Their soldiers hide inside it. The Greek army pretends to leave. The Trojans, believing the war is finally over, bring the horse inside their city. During the night, the hidden warriors emerge. The gates are opened. The Greek army returns, and Troy falls. It is one of the most famous stories in ancient literature. But for centuries, scholars debated whether Troy itself had ever existed. Was it a real city? Was the Trojan War based on an actual conflict? Or was the entire story simply a poetic invention? Then archaeology entered the mystery. In the 19th century, excavations began at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. Beneath the earth were layers upon layers of settlement. One city had been built over another. Walls had been destroyed. Buildings had been rebuilt. Civilizations had come and gone. The site was not merely a ruin. It was a timeline. And somewhere within those layers was the city that would become associated with Troy. The discovery changed the debate. Troy was no longer simply a place from poetry. There had been a real settlement at Hisarlik for thousands of years. But that did not prove Homer's story. Finding Troy does not automatically prove that Achilles existed. It does not prove that Helen was kidnapped. It does not prove that thousands of Greek warriors sailed across the Aegean. And it certainly does not prove that a gigantic wooden horse entered the city. Archaeology must separate what can be demonstrated from what can only be imagined. Still, the similarities are intriguing. The city had substantial defensive walls. It occupied a strategically important location. It stood near routes connecting the Aegean world with Anatolia and the Black Sea. A powerful city in such a location would have been valuable. It could control movement, trade, resources, and access to important waterways. Conflict was therefore entirely plausible. But what about the horse? This is where the story becomes more complicated. The wooden horse itself has never been discovered. Wood rarely survives thousands of years under ordinary archaeological conditions. Even if such a structure existed, it could have completely disappeared. But some researchers have suggested that the horse may not have been a literal horse at all. Ancient warfare involved siege machines, wooden structures, ships, rams, ladders, and other devices. A poetic description could transform a military object into a symbol. There is also another possibility. The horse may have been connected to a religious symbol or a sacred offering. In the ancient world, animals were frequently associated with gods and cities. A wooden horse could have carried symbolic meaning that later generations interpreted as part of a military deception. But then another question appears. Why would Homer include such a strange detail? Because it makes the story memorable. That is one possibility. A giant wooden horse is the kind of image that survives. It turns a complicated war into a single, unforgettable moment. The story becomes easier to tell, easier to remember, and easier to pass from one generation to another. This may explain why myths often contain extraordinary elements. A real battle becomes a war between heroes. A powerful king becomes a demigod. A natural disaster becomes the anger of a god. A siege becomes a story of deception. But beneath the symbolism, there may still be a historical event. This is why archaeology and mythology can sometimes work together. Neither should be treated as unquestionable proof, but both can provide clues. And the same principle appears in other ancient mysteries. Consider the story of the Ark of the Covenant. According to biblical tradition, the Ark was a sacred chest associated with the presence of God. It was carried by the Israelites and became one of the most important objects in their religious tradition. But the Ark eventually disappears from historical records. No confirmed archaeological discovery has identified it. That absence has created centuries of speculation. Was it destroyed? Hidden? Taken as a war trophy? Buried beneath an ancient temple? Or preserved somewhere unknown? The mystery became even more fascinating because later traditions claimed extraordinary powers for the object. Some stories describe people being struck down after touching it improperly. Others portray it as a source of divine power. Over time, these accounts inspired theories ranging from religious symbolism to ancient technology. But there is no reliable evidence that the Ark was a radioactive weapon or an extraterrestrial device. Those ideas belong to the realm of speculation. The real mystery is simpler and perhaps more profound. If the Ark existed as a historical object, what happened to it? Ancient objects disappear all the time. They are destroyed in wars. They are melted down. They are buried. They are reused. Or they simply decay. The disappearance of an object does not prove that it possessed supernatural power. It proves only that history is full of gaps, and those gaps create stories. Another ancient mystery comes from the ruins of Mesopotamia. Clay tablets have preserved thousands of years of human thought. Administrative records, letters, laws, mathematical calculations, religious rituals, myths, even ordinary transactions. These tablets survived because clay can be remarkably durable when fired. But imagine how much knowledge was recorded on materials that did not survive. Wood, leather, papyrus, fabric, paint, organic materials. Entire libraries could disappear while a handful of clay tablets remain. This means our understanding of ancient civilizations may be heavily distorted by what happened to survive. We may know enormous amounts about people who wrote on durable materials, and almost nothing about societies whose records were created on fragile ones. This is why a single archaeological discovery can become so important. One object can reveal a missing piece. One inscription can identify a forgotten king. One burial can expose an unknown ritual. One settlement can challenge an established timeline. And sometimes one strange object can raise more questions than it answers. That is exactly what makes the mysteries surrounding King Tutankhamun so compelling. The young pharaoh's tomb was filled with objects, but some appear to have been reused. Some were modified. Some may have been prepared for someone else. The tomb itself is unusually small compared with many royal burial complexes. And because the burial was discovered with such extraordinary treasures, it became easy for the public to imagine that everything inside had a perfectly clear story. But archaeology is rarely that simple. Ancient Egypt was not a static civilization. It changed constantly. Kings died. Dynasties shifted. Religious systems evolved. Political factions fought for influence. Objects were reused. Names were erased. Statues were altered. Tombs were robbed. And later rulers sometimes deliberately attempted to remove their predecessors from history. That means an artifact can survive while its original meaning disappears. Perhaps this is one reason the ancient world continues to feel mysterious. We see the remains, but we do not always see the people who created them. We see the monument, but not the conversation that happened while it was being built. We see the burial, but not the emotions of the people who placed the body inside. We see the symbol, but not necessarily the belief behind it. And sometimes we see the myth long before we discover the archaeology. Troy demonstrates this perfectly. For centuries, people knew the story. Then archaeology confirmed that a major ancient settlement really existed where Troy was supposed to be. That does not prove every detail of the epic, but it reminds us that myths should not always be dismissed as meaningless fantasy. They can preserve distorted memories. A real city can become legendary. A real conflict can become epic. A real disaster can become supernatural. And an ordinary object can become a symbol. Perhaps the Trojan horse was exactly what Homer described. Perhaps it was a metaphor. Perhaps it was a siege device. Perhaps the story combines several different events. We may never know. And that uncertainty is part of the power of the story. Because the most fascinating mysteries are not those where every question has already been answered. They are the ones where evidence and legend stand beside each other, close enough to suggest a connection, but far enough apart to keep the mystery alive. Beneath the ruins of Troy, stones still remain. In Egypt, the tomb of a young king still holds its silence. Across Mesopotamia, tablets preserve voices from civilizations that disappeared thousands of years ago. And beneath ancient landscapes everywhere, there are objects waiting to be found. Some will confirm what historians already believe. Others will force them to reconsider. And perhaps one day, archaeologists will uncover something that finally tells us what really happened at Troy. Until then, the wooden horse remains suspended between history and legend. A symbol of deception, a symbol of war, and perhaps something else. A reminder that the truth of the ancient world may not be hidden in one perfect record. It may be scattered across fragments. A ruined wall, a buried object, a forgotten inscription, a story passed from one generation to the next. And sometimes, when enough fragments come together, a legend that seemed impossible begins to look strangely familiar. What if the earth beneath our feet is not simply a graveyard of forgotten civilizations, but a library of human behavior? Every layer of soil can preserve traces of fear, ambition, religion, survival, and loss. A buried object can tell us what people valued. A damaged skeleton can reveal how they died. A ruined settlement can show how an entire society collapsed. And sometimes, the most disturbing discoveries are the ones that force us to confront the darkest choices people made when survival was at stake. From ancient rituals to desperate acts of cannibalism, archaeology has uncovered evidence that challenges our modern understanding of humanity. But perhaps the most frightening part is not that these things happened thousands of years ago. It is realizing how familiar some of the reasons behind them can still feel today. Deep beneath the soil of ancient Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of violence that occurred long before written history. At first, a broken human bone may seem insignificant. Bones can break after burial. They can be damaged by animals. They can crack under pressure from the earth. But certain patterns tell a different story. Cut marks, intentional fractures, burning, repeated blows. These traces can reveal what happened to a human body long after the person who caused the injuries has disappeared. And sometimes, those marks point towards something deeply unsettling: cannibalism. One of the strongest archaeological examples comes from the Goyet Cave in Belgium. Inside the cave, researchers discovered human remains associated with Neanderthals. The evidence suggested that several individuals had been processed in ways consistent with the removal of flesh and extraction of marrow. Some bones had been deliberately broken. Others showed cut marks. And certain remains may even have been modified into tools. For modern people, the idea is horrifying. But archaeology demands that we resist the urge to immediately impose our own assumptions. Cannibalism is not a single behavior with a single explanation. In human history, it has appeared under radically different circumstances. Sometimes it has been associated with ritual, sometimes warfare, sometimes punishment, and sometimes starvation. Imagine a prehistoric community trapped in an environment where food has disappeared. The animals they depended on are gone. The winter is longer than expected. Hunting parties return empty-handed. Children are hungry. The elderly are becoming weaker. Every available resource has been exhausted. In such circumstances, survival can push human behavior toward unimaginable extremes. But what if the behavior was not driven by hunger? What if it was ritual? That possibility changes the entire interpretation. Perhaps consuming part of a deceased person was believed to preserve their spirit. Perhaps it was an act of respect. Perhaps it was intended to absorb strength. Or perhaps the remains belonged to enemies and were treated as trophies. We cannot know with certainty. The bones cannot tell us the entire story. But they can tell us that something happened. And that distinction is crucial. Archaeology is often less about finding absolute answers and more about narrowing the possibilities. The same principle applies to one of the most mysterious practices discovered in prehistoric Scandinavia. Human skulls were found associated with an ancient lake environment in Sweden. Some had been placed on wooden stakes. The evidence suggested deliberate manipulation. These were not simply bodies left where they fell. Someone had handled them, prepared them, and displayed them. But the purpose remains uncertain. Were these enemies, ancestors, criminals, ritual victims? Theories vary. One possibility is that the skulls were used to display power. Another is that they were connected to religious beliefs about death and protection. The lake may have been a sacred location. Perhaps the people who lived there believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was different from the way we understand it today. To us, a skull on a wooden stake is a symbol of violence. To them, it might have represented something entirely different. That is one of the hardest lessons archaeology teaches us. The meaning of an object cannot always be understood from its appearance. A statue may look terrifying, but represent protection. A burial may appear cruel, but be considered sacred. A destroyed building may look like the result of war, but have been deliberately dismantled for ritual reasons. The past cannot be interpreted by appearance alone. And then there are places where violence appears impossible to ignore. Mass graves. Across history, people have buried the dead in groups during wars, epidemics, disasters, and political violence. When archaeologists uncover such sites, the challenge is not only determining how people died, it is determining why. A mass grave can represent a single catastrophic event, or it can contain people who died over years. The position of the bodies can reveal whether they were carefully arranged or hastily thrown into the ground. The injuries can reveal whether weapons were involved. The age distribution can reveal whether an entire community was targeted. And sometimes DNA can show that many of the victims were related. Each clue adds another piece. But the final story may remain incomplete. One of the most painful aspects of these discoveries is anonymity. A skeleton does not automatically tell us a name. The person who died may have been a father, a mother, a child, a soldier, a farmer, a prisoner, a stranger. Thousands of years later, those identities can disappear. Yet archaeology gives researchers a chance to restore at least part of the story. Modern forensic methods can reveal age, trauma, disease, diet, migration, family relationships, sometimes even the environment in which a person lived. A bone can become a biography. And this is where archaeology becomes more than the study of ancient objects. It becomes the recovery of forgotten human lives. But there are mysteries that move beyond death. There are stories of strange sounds, unexplained disappearances, and supernatural beliefs that grew around places where people lived and died. For centuries, miners around the world have told stories of mysterious beings beneath the earth. One of the most famous traditions comes from mining communities in Europe and North America. Miners spoke of small underground spirits known as Tommyknockers. They were said to live inside mines. Sometimes they were mischievous. Sometimes they were dangerous. But most importantly, they were believed to warn miners of impending disaster. A knock from inside the rock could mean a collapse was coming. A strange sound might signal danger. A flickering light could suggest another presence deep underground. Modern science provides many possible explanations for such experiences. Rock can expand and contract. Water can move through cracks. Timber can shift under pressure. Gas can create sounds. Underground environments distort perception. And miners working long hours in darkness are naturally sensitive to even the smallest changes. But understanding the physical explanation does not make the legend meaningless. The Tommyknocker stories reveal something about the psychology of people working in dangerous environments. When death can arrive without warning, people search for patterns. A sound becomes a warning. A shadow becomes a spirit. A coincidence becomes a sign. The legend becomes part of the culture that helps people survive fear. And perhaps this is why supernatural stories are so common around dangerous places. Mines, forests, mountains, battlefields, shipwrecks, tombs. These are environments where uncertainty is unavoidable. The human mind hates uncertainty, so it creates explanations. Sometimes those explanations are religious, sometimes scientific, sometimes supernatural, and sometimes all three exist side by side. Ancient Egypt provides another example. The Egyptians developed elaborate beliefs about death and the afterlife. They did not see death simply as an ending. They saw it as a transformation. That belief influenced everything from tomb construction to mummification. The body had to be preserved. The deceased needed supplies. Protective symbols were placed around the burial. Spells were written to help the dead navigate the afterlife. From our perspective, these practices can appear mysterious. But within their culture, they were logical. The tomb was not simply a grave. It was a gateway. The objects inside were not random possessions. They had meaning. This brings us back to the strange artifacts discovered around ancient royal tombs. When archaeologists uncover an object whose purpose is unclear, they cannot simply assume it was ceremonial. They must examine the material, the manufacturing technique, the location, the surrounding objects, the age of the layer in which it was found, and whether similar objects exist elsewhere. Sometimes the answer is surprisingly ordinary. Sometimes it reveals an unknown ritual, and occasionally it exposes a gap in our understanding. This is especially important at famous archaeological sites. The more famous a site becomes, the more people expect every discovery to be extraordinary. But real archaeology is usually slower, careful, patient, and often frustrating. A mysterious object may take years to interpret. Researchers may disagree. New evidence may overturn an earlier theory. A supposed hidden chamber may turn out to be a geological anomaly. A legendary artifact may turn out to be a later invention, and a discovery that initially seems insignificant may eventually become one of the most important finds in the field. That uncertainty is what makes archaeology so compelling. It is not a treasure hunt where every excavation ends with a definitive answer. It is an investigation into a world that has left only fragments behind. Consider the ancient Greeks. They created stories about gods, monsters, heroes, and impossible journeys. But they also developed serious scientific thought. Philosophers questioned the nature of matter. Astronomers studied the heavens. Engineers designed machines. Physicians investigated the human body. One of the boldest thinkers was Anaxagoras. At a time when many people viewed celestial bodies through religious traditions, he argued that the moon was a physical object rather than a divine being. He suggested that its light was reflected sunlight. He proposed that the moon had physical features, and he attempted to explain celestial events through natural processes. His ideas were controversial. They challenged established beliefs, and they demonstrate something essential about the ancient world. Mystery and rational thought were not always opposites. People could believe in gods while simultaneously trying to understand nature. They could perform rituals while observing eclipses. They could fear supernatural forces while developing mathematics. Human beings have always lived between explanation and uncertainty. Perhaps that is why unsolved mysteries continue to fascinate us. We want answers. But we are also drawn to the possibility that something remains hidden. A strange artifact, a forgotten burial, an unexplained inscription, a vanished civilization, a story that refuses to die. The ancient world still contains thousands of such mysteries. Some will eventually be solved. Others may remain unanswered forever. But every discovery brings us closer to understanding the people who lived before us. And sometimes, the most frightening discovery is not evidence of monsters or supernatural forces. It is evidence of ourselves, the violence we are capable of, the fears we carry, the beliefs we create, the sacrifices we make, and the lengths we can go to when survival is at stake. The earth remembers all of it. Every wound, every burial, every forgotten ritual, every object placed beside the dead. And as long as archaeologists continue digging, those memories will continue rising from the darkness. Not as legends, not as ghosts, but as evidence. And sometimes, evidence is far more chilling than any story. Imagine standing in a silent archaeological chamber, surrounded by thousands of years of dust and darkness, when your flashlight suddenly reveals something that should not be there. Not gold, not a royal statue, not another familiar artifact. Something strange, something whose purpose remains unknown. Now imagine that this object was discovered near the burial complex of one of ancient Egypt's most famous pharaohs, King Tutankhamun. For decades, archaeologists have searched these ancient ruins for clues that could rewrite what we know about the boy king. But what if one overlooked object is now forcing researchers to ask an entirely different question? What if the greatest mystery surrounding Tutankhamun was never fully buried with him? Tonight, we descend into a world of hidden chambers, forgotten rituals, mysterious artifacts, ancient curses, vanished civilizations, and discoveries that refuse to fit neatly into the history books. Because sometimes, the most disturbing mysteries are not the ones we cannot find. They are the ones we find and still cannot explain. The story of King Tutankhamun has always been surrounded by mystery. His tomb was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, almost perfectly preserved beneath the Valley of the Kings. Inside were thousands of objects, treasures, weapons, chariots, furniture, jewelry, and the famous golden funerary mask that transformed Tutankhamun into one of the most recognizable figures of the ancient world. But the discovery also created another mystery. Why was the tomb so different from what archaeologists expected? Tutankhamun was a pharaoh, yet his burial chamber was relatively small compared with the grand tombs constructed for other rulers. Some researchers have proposed that the tomb may originally have been designed for someone else, perhaps a high-ranking royal figure, before being adapted for the young king after his sudden death. And this is where the mystery becomes darker. Tutankhamun died when he was still very young. His reign had lasted only about a decade, and his death appears to have come unexpectedly. There was no time to construct the enormous royal burial complex that a pharaoh might normally receive. Instead, a smaller existing tomb may have been prepared for him. But if that is true, what was the original purpose of the structure? And what other objects may have been placed there before the burial was sealed? Archaeologists have spent generations examining every corner of the Valley of the Kings, searching for answers. The discovery of unusual objects, architectural irregularities, and possible hidden spaces has continued to fuel speculation that the known tomb may represent only part of the story. One of the most famous theories involves possible hidden chambers behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. For years, researchers debated whether unexplored spaces might exist beyond the decorated walls. Some theories suggested that these chambers could contain additional burial equipment, storage areas, or perhaps another royal burial entirely. The idea became especially dramatic when some researchers proposed that a hidden chamber might be connected to Queen Nefertiti. Nefertiti remains one of ancient Egypt's greatest mysteries. She was the powerful queen who lived during the controversial Amarna period, alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten. Her famous painted bust shows a woman whose image has survived for more than 3,000 years. Yet despite her importance, the location of her final burial has never been established with certainty. Could Tutankhamun's tomb somehow be connected to her? The possibility captured worldwide attention. But archaeology is rarely as simple as a mysterious wall and a dramatic theory. Scientific investigations have produced conflicting results, and some researchers have argued that the supposed hidden chambers may not exist at all. Others have pointed to natural variations in the rock, construction features, or scanning limitations as possible explanations. And that is what makes archaeology so fascinating. A mystery can begin with one strange observation, but every answer creates another question. Even the famous Golden Death Mask has its own uncertainties. The mask is instantly recognizable. Gold, blue glass, stripes. The face of a young pharaoh staring forward with an expression that seems almost alive. But historians have debated whether the mask was originally made specifically for Tutankhamun. Some details have fueled speculation that it may have been adapted from an earlier royal object. The name associated with the mask and certain construction details have been examined by researchers searching for clues about its original owner. Was it created for Tutankhamun? Was it modified after his death? Or was the object part of a larger royal tradition in which valuable burial equipment could be repurposed when circumstances demanded it? There is still no universally accepted answer to every question. And this uncertainty reveals something important about ancient Egypt. The civilization we often imagine as perfectly organized was actually a world of political upheaval, sudden deaths, religious transformations, power struggles, and rapidly changing traditions. Tutankhamun lived during one of the most turbulent periods in Egyptian history. His father, Akhenaten, had dramatically changed Egypt's religious system, elevating the worship of the Aten above the traditional gods. Temples were abandoned. Old religious practices were suppressed. A new capital was established at Amarna. Then, after Akhenaten's death, the old religious order returned. The young Tutankhamun became king. And suddenly, the kingdom began reversing years of religious change. Temples were restored. Traditional gods returned. The capital moved back toward the ancient centers of Egyptian power. Tutankhamun's reign therefore represents more than the story of a young king. It represents a civilization attempting to repair itself after a period of extraordinary upheaval. Perhaps that is why every artifact associated with him seems to carry an additional layer of mystery. A small object can reveal a ritual. A damaged inscription can expose a political conflict. A reused burial object can reveal how quickly events unfolded after a ruler's death. And a hidden chamber, if one were ever confirmed, could potentially transform our understanding of the royal family itself. But Tutankhamun is only one doorway into the larger mystery of the ancient world. Because beneath the sands, forests, mountains, caves, and abandoned settlements of our planet are countless discoveries that challenge the assumption that the past was simple. In one place, archaeologists have uncovered ancient texts describing rituals that sound almost impossible to modern ears. In another, human remains reveal violence, famine, or desperate survival. Elsewhere, prehistoric people created sophisticated tools long before conventional histories once expected them to. And sometimes, the mystery is not that an object is too advanced. It is that we no longer understand why it was created. Consider the ancient cursed tablets discovered in the Mediterranean and Near East. Small sheets of metal or lead were inscribed with names, requests, and supernatural appeals. People used them to ask gods or spirits to harm rivals, silence opponents, influence legal disputes, or change the outcome of conflicts. To modernize, they may appear irrational, but to the people who created them, these objects were tools. They represented another form of power. A person who had no political influence, no army, and no wealth could still write a curse and place it into the world, believing that supernatural forces might carry out their wishes. These tablets reveal something deeply human. When ordinary methods fail, people search for extraordinary ones. That instinct has survived across thousands of years, and it appears again in legends surrounding haunted mines. Deep beneath the ground, miners have always lived with dangers that cannot be seen until it is too late. Rock collapses, toxic gases, flooding, darkness, isolation. In mining communities, stories of mysterious spirits became part of the culture. Strange knocking sounds were interpreted as warnings from dead miners. Flickering lights were seen as supernatural signs. Unexplained noises became stories passed from one generation to another. Science may offer explanations for many of these events, but the stories remain, because fear does not always disappear when an explanation is found. Sometimes it becomes part of the legend. And perhaps that is the real power of unsolved mysteries. They survive because they occupy the space between what we know and what we fear might be true. The ancient world is full of such spaces. A tomb that seems too small. A chamber that may or may not exist. A mask whose original purpose remains debated. A civilization that disappeared. A strange inscription no one can completely interpret. A mass grave that forces historians to confront uncomfortable memories. A prehistoric tool that reveals unexpected intelligence. A ship that vanished. A ritual that makes no sense to modern observers. Each discovery is a fragment, and archaeology is the attempt to assemble those fragments into a picture of humanity's past. But the picture is never complete. There will always be missing pieces. And sometimes, the missing piece is exactly what makes the story terrifying. So when we look at the image of Tutankhamun's golden mask, perhaps we should not see only a symbol of ancient wealth. We should see a question. Who was the boy behind the gold? What happened during his final days? Why was his burial prepared under such unusual circumstances? Were there objects placed near him whose meaning has been lost? And somewhere beneath the ancient stones of Egypt, could there still be another piece of the story waiting to be discovered? For now, the answers remain buried. But history has a strange habit. Just when we believe we understand the past, someone removes another layer of dust. And beneath it is something we never expected to see. The deeper we travel into the forgotten corners of human history, the more difficult it becomes to separate what we know from what we only assume. Every artifact is a message from another age, but not every message can still be read. Sometimes the object survives while its purpose disappears. Sometimes the structure remains while the people who built it are forgotten. And sometimes the evidence seems to contradict everything we thought we understood. This is where the most unsettling mysteries begin. Imagine an ancient settlement buried beneath layers of earth. For centuries, nobody remembers its name. The people who lived there are gone. Their language has disappeared. Their homes have collapsed. Their tools lie scattered beneath the soil. Then, thousands of years later, archaeologists arrive and uncover the remains. At first, everything appears ordinary. Pottery, stone tools, bones, broken walls. Then they find something that changes the entire investigation. An object that seems too unusual for its surroundings. A symbol that does not match anything nearby. A structure whose purpose remains impossible to determine. And suddenly, the forgotten settlement is no longer just an archaeological site. It becomes a question. One of the greatest examples of this comes from the mysterious world of prehistoric Europe, where archaeologists have discovered enormous stone monuments built thousands of years before written history. These structures are often called megaliths. Some are simple standing stones. Others form enormous circles, chambers, passageways, and monuments aligned with astronomical events. The people who constructed them had no modern machinery, no steel cranes, and no written engineering manuals that survive today. Yet they were able to move enormous stones, shape landscapes, and organize large groups of people around projects that may have taken generations to complete. Why? Was it religion? Astronomy? Burial? Political power? Or something else entirely? At sites such as Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, the mystery becomes even more fascinating. The monumental structures were built thousands of years ago, at a time when archaeologists once believed humans were still living mostly as simple hunter-gatherers. But the massive carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe revealed something far more complicated. These people could organize labor. They could transport heavy stones. They could carve detailed animals into limestone. They could create monumental spaces long before the rise of the traditional cities of Mesopotamia. And that forced historians to reconsider an important question. Did civilization create organized religion? Or did organized religion help create civilization? Perhaps people did not first build cities and then construct temples. Perhaps they gathered around sacred places first, and those gatherings eventually encouraged permanent settlements, agriculture, and social organization. If so, the foundations of civilization may have been very different from the story we learned in school. But Göbekli Tepe is only one example. Across the world, ancient structures continue to raise similar questions. In the mountains of Peru, enormous stones were fitted together with extraordinary precision. In Egypt, massive monuments were constructed with mathematical and astronomical sophistication. In Britain, enormous stones were arranged across the landscape. In the Pacific, isolated communities transported giant statues. And in the jungles of Central America, Maya cities rose from landscapes that modern explorers once believed were almost untouched. The more archaeologists discover, the harder it becomes to describe ancient people as primitive. They were not modern humans with modern technology, but they possessed something equally important: observation, patience, organization, and an extraordinary ability to solve problems using the materials available to them. Sometimes, however, ancient technology becomes genuinely difficult to understand. Consider the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered among the remains of an ancient shipwreck, The device appeared at first to be nothing more than a heavily corroded collection of bronze fragments. But inside those fragments were gears, dozens of them. Tiny, carefully engineered components designed to calculate astronomical cycles. The mechanism could track celestial movements and predict astronomical events. It was so sophisticated that for years, researchers struggled to understand how such a device could have been created in the ancient world. The Antikythera mechanism did not prove that ancient Greeks possessed modern technology, but it proved something almost as important. Ancient engineers could create mechanical systems far more sophisticated than many people once assumed. And that raises another uncomfortable question. How much ancient technology has completely disappeared? Imagine an invention created from wood. After 1,000 years, it rots. An instrument made from organic materials disappears. A building collapses. A machine is dismantled and its metal reused. A library burns. A civilization falls. The knowledge vanishes. Archaeologists then discover only fragments. Perhaps that is why the ancient world can sometimes appear so mysterious. We are not looking at a complete civilization. We are looking at its ruins, and ruins are incomplete memories. This problem becomes especially powerful when examining ancient texts. Thousands of manuscripts have been recovered from caves, temples, tombs, and abandoned settlements. Some contain religious teachings. Others record laws, trade, astronomy, medicine, or mythology. But there are also manuscripts written in languages that remain undeciphered. The symbols are visible. The meaning is not. One of the most famous examples is the Voynich manuscript. Its origin and exact purpose remain disputed, and its strange writing system has fascinated codebreakers for generations. The pages contain unfamiliar symbols, strange illustrations, plants that are difficult to identify, astronomical diagrams, and mysterious human figures. Is it a genuine historical manuscript? A coded document? A lost language? Or an elaborate deception? No explanation has achieved universal acceptance, and that is precisely what makes it so compelling. Because the manuscript exists, the pages exist, the ink exists, the illustrations exist, but the voice of its creator remains silent. It is like finding a message inside a bottle that has crossed centuries, only to discover that the alphabet itself has disappeared. Yet perhaps the most frightening mysteries are not ancient at all. Some belong to the modern era. Take Flight 19. In December 1945, 5 American military aircraft disappeared during a training mission over the Atlantic. The disappearance became one of the most famous aviation mysteries of the 20th century. A rescue aircraft also vanished. No clear wreckage immediately appeared. No simple explanation satisfied the public imagination. The area became associated with the Bermuda Triangle, and soon theories multiplied. Strange magnetic forces, unknown weather phenomena, underwater anomalies, even extraterrestrial intervention. But there is an important lesson here. When evidence is incomplete, human imagination fills the empty spaces. That does not mean every mystery is supernatural. It means uncertainty creates stories. And those stories can become stronger than the original evidence. The same thing happened with ancient tombs. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, newspapers around the world transformed the discovery into a legend of an ancient curse. People connected the deaths and illnesses of individuals associated with the excavation to supernatural punishment. The idea became so powerful that it entered popular culture. But there was never solid scientific evidence proving that Tutankhamun's tomb carried a supernatural curse. Still, the story survived. Why? Because tombs are already symbols of death. A sealed chamber, a forgotten king, a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, and a warning that seemed to come from the darkness itself. The curse became a perfect mystery. But beneath the legend lies something much more interesting. The ancient Egyptians really did believe that words, names, images, and rituals possessed power. A tomb was not simply a grave. It was part of a carefully designed journey into the afterlife. The paintings were not decoration. The objects were not random. The inscriptions were not meaningless. Every element had a purpose. And when that purpose is lost, modern archaeologists must reconstruct it piece by piece. That is why the strange object discovered near Tutankhamun's burial complex becomes so important. Its significance does not necessarily come from being supernatural or technologically impossible. Its importance comes from uncertainty. Why was it there? Who created it? Was it connected to the burial? Was it reused? Was it ceremonial? Was it personal? Or did it belong to another stage of the site's history? An unusual artifact can sometimes tell researchers more through the questions it raises than through the answers it provides. And this brings us back to the central mystery of ancient Egypt. How much remains hidden? The Valley of the Kings has already revealed some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in history. Yet every excavation reminds us how incomplete the record is. There are tombs still undiscovered. There are inscriptions waiting to be interpreted. There are artifacts sitting in museums whose original purposes remain uncertain. There are entire settlements buried beneath modern landscapes. And somewhere beneath the desert, perhaps, are answers to questions that humanity has been asking for thousands of years. Who truly controlled Egypt during its most turbulent periods? What happened to the royal family after Akhenaten? Where did Nefertiti die? Was Tutankhamun's burial prepared in a hurry? Were parts of his funerary equipment originally made for someone else? And how many objects connected to these events have yet to be found? But the mystery extends far beyond Egypt. From the frozen landscapes of Siberia to the caves of Europe. From ancient India to the jungles of Central America. From forgotten mines to deep ocean shipwrecks. Human history is filled with stories that remain unfinished. Sometimes archaeology solves them. Sometimes it replaces one mystery with another. And sometimes it simply tells us that we were wrong. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not a finished book. It is a damaged manuscript. Some pages are missing. Some are burned. Some are written in languages we cannot read. And some pages are still buried beneath our feet. Every new excavation turns another page. Every strange artifact becomes another sentence. And every unanswered question reminds us that the past is far larger than the portion we can see. So the next time you look at the golden mask of King Tutankhamun, remember that the face staring back at you may not represent the end of the story. It may only be the beginning, because somewhere in the darkness beneath the ancient sands, another discovery could still be waiting. And when that discovery finally emerges into the light, it may force us to rewrite a chapter of history we thought we understood. The real mystery is not whether the ancient world had secrets. We already know it did. The real mystery is how many of those secrets are still buried. What if some of the greatest mysteries of human history were never meant to be solved? What if the evidence we have uncovered is only a small fragment of a much larger story, scattered across deserts, mountains, caves, ancient cities, and forgotten graves? Every generation believes it understands the people who came before us. Then a single discovery appears, and suddenly the familiar story begins to crack. A strange artifact, a hidden burial, an ancient weapon, a body that should not be there, a symbol no one can translate. These discoveries do not simply add information to history. Sometimes they force us to question the foundations of what we thought we knew. For thousands of years, human beings have searched for answers in the remains of the dead. We open tombs, examine bones, decode inscriptions, and reconstruct ruined cities. But every discovery comes with a warning. The past does not speak clearly. It whispers through fragments. And sometimes, those whispers are disturbing. One of the most haunting discoveries in archaeology comes from Northern Europe, where researchers uncovered evidence of an ancient ritual involving human heads. Thousands of years ago, the landscape looked completely different. What is now dry land was once covered by water. Around the edges of an ancient lake, prehistoric communities lived, hunted, and died. Then archaeologists began uncovering human skulls. At first, the discovery was already disturbing enough. But examination revealed something far stranger. Some of the skulls had been pierced by wooden stakes. The evidence suggested that the heads had not simply been discarded after death. They had been deliberately displayed. For modern people, the image is horrifying. But archaeology demands that we resist the temptation to judge the past using only modern assumptions. Why would a prehistoric community do this? Was it punishment? Was it warfare? Was it a warning to enemies? Or was it part of a ritual connected to death and the supernatural? The truth remains uncertain. But one possibility is especially fascinating. Perhaps the people who performed these rituals believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was not as absolute as we imagine. The dead may have remained powerful. Their remains could have been used to protect a settlement, intimidate enemies, honor ancestors, or control supernatural forces. This idea appears repeatedly across human history. Ancient people did not always view death as the complete disappearance of a person. In many cultures, the dead remained part of society. They were remembered. They were feared. They were worshipped. And sometimes, they were deliberately placed in locations where the living could continue to interact with them. This belief becomes even more mysterious when we examine ancient mummies. On remote Scottish islands, archaeologists discovered some of the earliest known mummified remains from Britain. But these bodies were not ordinary. Different parts of the mummies appeared to come from different individuals. A skull might belong to one person, a pelvis to another, a limb to someone else. The result was almost like an ancient human puzzle. Why would anyone construct a body this way? One theory is that the remains were deliberately assembled as part of a ritual. Perhaps combining parts of ancestors represented the continuation of generations. Perhaps the body was intended to become a symbolic ancestor rather than the physical remains of one individual. Or perhaps there was another reason that we have not yet understood. What makes this discovery so powerful is that it challenges our assumptions about what a human body represented in prehistoric society. Today, we think of identity as belonging to one individual. But ancient cultures may have viewed identity differently. A person could be connected to an entire family, a clan, a lineage, an ancestor. The body itself may have been a physical representation of those connections. And if that interpretation is correct, then these unusual mummies were not simply remains. They were symbols, a physical bridge between generations. But ancient people were not always peaceful in their treatment of the dead. In the caves of Belgium, archaeologists found evidence of something far darker. Neanderthal remains showed signs of cutting, breaking, and crushing. Some bones had been opened to remove marrow. Others showed evidence of deliberate processing. The discovery suggested that at least some Neanderthal communities practiced cannibalism. For decades, popular culture portrayed Neanderthals as primitive and almost monstrous. But archaeology has revealed a much more complicated picture. Neanderthals made tools. They controlled fire. They cared for injured members of their communities. They buried their dead in some places. They survived in environments that would have been extraordinarily difficult. And yet, in certain circumstances, they may also have consumed members of their own species. Why? Survival is one possibility. During periods of extreme food shortage, consuming the dead may have been an act of desperation. But archaeologists have also considered ritual explanations. Perhaps the body of a deceased individual was treated in a specific cultural ceremony. Perhaps consuming parts of the body was connected to beliefs about identity, strength, or the spirit. We cannot know for certain. The bones provide evidence. They do not provide explanations. That distinction is critical. Archaeology can tell us what happened. It is much harder to determine why. And this problem appears again and again throughout the ancient world. Take the strange ritual baths of the Maya. In Guatemala, archaeologists discovered an ancient sweat bath associated with spiritual practices. To the Maya, such places could have had a sacred role connected with purification, childbirth, health, and transformation. The steam was not simply physical heat. It could have represented a transition between different states of existence, inside and outside, life and death, human and divine. Archaeologists discovered remains and offerings associated with the structure, suggesting that ceremonies were performed there. Imagine entering such a place thousands of years ago. The outside world disappears. The air becomes hot and heavy. Steam fills the chamber. The light becomes faint. People speak prayers. Offerings are placed nearby. And the boundary between ordinary life and the spiritual world begins to feel very thin. To the people who used these structures, the experience may have been deeply real. Today, we can analyze the architecture. We can date the remains. We can identify the materials, but we cannot fully reconstruct the emotions of the people who stood there. That is one of archaeology's greatest limitations. We can recover objects. We cannot recover memories. We can reconstruct walls. We cannot reconstruct the exact thoughts of the people who built them. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the study of ancient weapons. A weapon tells us something about conflict, but it can also reveal technology, craftsmanship, social organization, and even cultural beliefs. In prehistoric Australia, Aboriginal communities developed highly specialized tools and weapons suited to their environment. Some were designed for hunting, others for combat. Others had ceremonial or legal significance. Their apparent simplicity can be misleading. A wooden weapon may look primitive to the modern eye, but its shape reflects generations of experimentation. The curve, the balance, the weight, the distribution of force. Every detail could affect how it moved through the air or struck a target. The weapon was not merely wood, it was accumulated knowledge. Knowledge passed from one generation to another without written engineering manuals. This is a pattern we see throughout human history. Ancient people were constantly experimenting. They observed nature. They learned from failure. They refined their tools. And eventually, those improvements became traditions. The same principle appears in one of the oldest known throwing weapons ever discovered. A wooden throwing stick found in Europe has been dated to hundreds of thousands of years ago and associated with Neanderthals. Its shape suggests that it was deliberately manufactured for aerodynamic performance. That means its makers were thinking about more than simply creating an object. They were thinking about how the object would behave, how far it would travel, how it would move through the air, how much force it could deliver. This pushes us deeper into one of the greatest questions surrounding human evolution. When did complex technological thinking begin? Was it unique to Homo sapiens? Or were other human species capable of sophisticated engineering long before our own civilization appeared? The evidence increasingly suggests that intelligence was not a switch that suddenly turned on in modern humans. It evolved gradually. Different human species developed different abilities. They adapted. They invented. They learned. They survived. And some of their knowledge has disappeared forever. That missing knowledge may be one of the greatest mysteries of all. Imagine an ancient invention made entirely from organic materials. Wood, leather, plant fibers, bone. After thousands of years, almost nothing remains. The object disappears. The knowledge disappears with it. Only a few stone tools survive as clues. This is why our picture of prehistoric technology may be dramatically incomplete. Stone survives. Wood usually does not. Metal can be melted and reused. Textiles decay. Buildings collapse. Knowledge disappears when communities vanish. The archaeological record is therefore biased toward what can survive. You may find a few stone shelves, a metal key, a piece of pottery, and a fragment of one page. From those fragments, you attempt to reconstruct the civilization that created the library. That is what archaeologists are doing. And sometimes, the fragments are enough to reveal extraordinary stories. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, inscriptions preserve evidence of a civilization that developed complex systems of law, administration, religion, mathematics, and astronomy. The Babylonian world was not simply a collection of primitive settlements. It was an organized society capable of recording information in extraordinary detail. One artifact associated with this world is the famous stele depicting the sun god Shamash. The image shows the deity seated in a divine setting, while cuneiform writing records religious and legal information. The object is a reminder that ancient civilizations did not separate religion, government, law, and science in the same way modern societies often do. Everything was connected. The heavens influenced earthly life. The gods were part of political authority. Rituals were linked to social order. Writing preserved both practical information and sacred traditions. And beneath all of it was a deep desire to understand the forces controlling human existence. That same desire still exists today. We may use satellites instead of omens, telescopes instead of temple priests, computers instead of clay tablets. But the question remains unchanged. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What happened before us? And what will remain after we are gone? Perhaps that is why ancient mysteries continue to fascinate us. They are not really just about ancient people. They are about ourselves. When we uncover a prehistoric grave, we are confronting another human being. When we examine an ancient weapon, we are seeing the problem of survival through another person's eyes. When we enter a forgotten tomb, we are entering someone's attempt to defeat oblivion. And when we stare at a mysterious artifact whose purpose has been forgotten, we are looking at a message from someone who believed their world would continue. But their civilization disappeared. Their language changed. Their buildings collapsed. Their names were forgotten. Only fragments remained, until someone found them again. And perhaps that is the most chilling thought of all. One day, our own civilization could become an archaeological mystery. Future researchers may uncover our buildings but misunderstand their purpose. They may find our machines and have no idea how they worked. They may discover objects whose meaning has been completely forgotten. They may debate why we built enormous cities, why we created monuments, why we buried our dead, why we recorded our thoughts. And perhaps they will ask the same question we ask when we look into the darkness of ancient history. Who were they? What happened to them? And why did they disappear? For now, those questions belong to the past. But every discovery reminds us that the line between the known and unknown is much thinner than we think. And somewhere beneath the soil, beneath the ruins, beneath the forgotten cities and ancient tombs, another answer may already be waiting. All it needs is someone willing to uncover it. What if the greatest mystery is not what we have discovered, but what is still waiting to be found? Beneath deserts, beneath ancient cities, beneath forests, mountains, oceans, and forgotten tombs, countless pieces of human history remain hidden. Some may confirm what we already believe. Others may destroy it completely. Because every time archaeologists uncover something unexpected, the past becomes a little less familiar. And tonight, as we reach the final chapter of this journey, we return to the question that started it all. What was that strange object near the burial place of King Tutankhamun, and why does it matter? Perhaps the answer is not simply about one pharaoh, one tomb, or one artifact. Perhaps it is about how little of our own history we truly understand. Then, in 1922, a staircase appeared beneath the desert floor. Howard Carter followed it downward, step by step, deeper into the earth, until he reached a sealed doorway bearing the royal symbols of a forgotten king. Behind that doorway was one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made. Gold, jewelry, chariots, weapons, furniture, ceremonial objects, and at the center of it all, the golden burial mask of a young pharaoh. The discovery transformed Tutankhamun into a legend. But the most important discovery may not have been the gold. It was the evidence of a world that existed before us and disappeared without leaving a complete explanation. Tutankhamun's tomb was not simply a treasure chamber. It was a time capsule. Every object inside represented something: a belief, a ritual, a political relationship, a technological skill, a memory, and perhaps even a mistake. Because the tomb itself raises questions. Why was it so small for a pharaoh? Why were some objects apparently prepared for someone else? Why did certain pieces appear to have been altered or reused? Why was Tutankhamun buried with such extraordinary wealth despite his short reign? And what happened during those final days before the tomb was sealed? We may never know every answer. But that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the story alive. Archaeology does not always give us certainty. Sometimes it gives us possibilities. And sometimes those possibilities are more powerful than any simple answer. The strange artifact found near Tutankhamun's burial complex fits into that larger mystery. An object whose design does not immediately match familiar examples forces researchers to stop and look again. Perhaps it was ceremonial, perhaps practical, perhaps connected to a forgotten tradition. Perhaps it was moved from somewhere else. Or perhaps it belonged to a part of the royal story that has not yet been reconstructed. The important point is this: an unexplained artifact is not proof of an impossible civilization. It is not automatically evidence of aliens. It is not proof of supernatural forces, but it is a reason to investigate. And history changes when researchers are willing to investigate instead of assuming they already know the answer. That principle has transformed archaeology again and again. For decades, ancient people were underestimated. Then discoveries forced historians to change their minds. Prehistoric communities were once portrayed as simple and technologically limited. Then archaeologists found sophisticated tools. Ancient cities were once believed to have emerged in a straightforward sequence. Then monumental sites appeared that challenged those timelines. Neanderthals were once imagined as unintelligent brutes. Then evidence revealed complex behavior, craftsmanship, social care, and perhaps symbolic practices. The ancient Greeks were celebrated for philosophy, but archaeological evidence also reveals their extraordinary engineering. Water clocks, odometers, mechanical devices, astronomical calculations. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrated that ancient engineers could construct intricate machines capable of modeling celestial cycles. And yet even this remarkable invention raises a darker question. How much ancient knowledge disappeared before anyone could record it? Imagine an ancient engineer creating a machine that works perfectly. The machine is passed to another generation. Then war arrives. The city falls. The workshop burns. The engineer dies. The machine is destroyed. The knowledge disappears. 1,000 years later, archaeologists find only a fragment of metal. They might never know what it was. That is how civilizations disappear. Not always in one dramatic moment. Sometimes, knowledge simply stops being transmitted. And when knowledge disappears, history becomes a mystery. This is why the ancient world contains so many objects whose purposes remain uncertain. A carved stone, a mysterious tablet, a strange burial, a weapon, a statue, a mechanical device, an underground chamber. Each one is a fragment of a conversation whose other speaker is gone. But perhaps there is another reason these mysteries matter. They remind us that civilization is fragile. The Maya built enormous cities. The Babylonians created sophisticated systems of writing and administration. The Egyptians constructed monuments that still dominate the landscape thousands of years later. Yet every one of these civilizations experienced transformation. Some collapsed, some migrated, some were absorbed into new cultures. Their languages changed, their political systems disappeared, their sacred traditions were forgotten, and eventually, archaeologists had to rediscover them. The same pattern can be seen in places where mass graves reveal the darkest side of human history. Hundreds of people can disappear from official records. Their names can be forgotten. Their families can wait for answers that never come. Then, decades later, bones are discovered beneath the earth. Suddenly, the past is no longer abstract. It has faces, families, lives, and unanswered questions. Archaeology can recover evidence, but it cannot undo what happened. That is why discoveries of human remains carry a responsibility greater than simple curiosity. They remind us that history is not only about kings and monuments. It is also about ordinary people. Workers, children, farmers, soldiers, mothers, travelers, miners, people whose names may never be known. Their lives were real. Their fears were real. Their hopes were real. And eventually, the earth covered them, until someone came searching. The same is true of the ancient miners, whose stories became legends of mysterious underground spirits. For centuries, miners listened to strange sounds beneath the earth. Knocking, cracking, shifting rock, distant echoes. Sometimes these sounds may have been natural. Sometimes they may have warned of danger. And sometimes people transformed them into stories about supernatural beings. The Tommyknockers became one such legend. Spirits of dead miners who were said to live beneath the earth. Some stories describe them as mischievous. Others portrayed them as guardians who warned living miners of approaching disasters. Whether supernatural or not, the legend reveals something deeply human. When people work in dangerous places, they search for meaning in uncertainty. They create stories to explain what they cannot control. And those stories survive long after the original danger has disappeared. The same human instinct appears in the legend of Tutankhamun's curse. A sealed tomb, a dead king, strange deaths, newspapers hungry for a sensational story. And suddenly, archaeology became mythology. But the real story is more powerful than the curse. A young ruler died. His kingdom changed. His tomb was sealed. His civilization disappeared. Then, thousands of years later, his name returned to the world. That alone is extraordinary. Tutankhamun defeated one of the greatest enemies known to humanity: oblivion. For thousands of years, his civilization could not speak. Then one staircase reopened the conversation. And now, every new artifact connected to his world becomes another sentence, another clue, another opportunity to understand what really happened. Perhaps someday, archaeologists will discover another chamber. Perhaps another royal burial will emerge from the desert. Perhaps a forgotten inscription will finally identify the people connected to Tutankhamun's final days. Or perhaps the strange object near his burial site will remain unexplained forever. That possibility should not disappoint us. It should remind us of something important. Mystery is not failure. Sometimes mystery is simply the honest boundary of human knowledge. We should not fill every gap with speculation. We should not turn every strange artifact into evidence of impossible technology. We should not replace uncertainty with certainty simply because certainty makes a better story. The real story is often more fascinating. Scientists find evidence. They test it. They challenge their own assumptions. They disagree. They return to the site. They scan the walls. They examine the bones. They compare inscriptions. They revise theories. And slowly, sometimes painfully, the truth begins to emerge. That process is what makes archaeology so powerful. Because the past does not belong to legends. It belongs to evidence. And evidence can change everything. So as this journey comes to an end, think about what we have seen. Ancient tombs, lost civilizations, mysterious manuscripts, forgotten technologies, human remains, haunted mines, ancient rituals, prehistoric weapons, unexplained structures, lost aircraft, cursed tablets, and a young Egyptian king whose golden face continues to stare across thousands of years. These stories may appear unrelated, but they share one common thread. Human beings leave traces behind. Sometimes those traces survive for millions of years. Sometimes they disappear within a generation. And sometimes one tiny object survives when an entire civilization does not. That object becomes a message from people who cannot speak. A message that says, we were here, we built, we believed, we feared, we loved, we fought, we created, and eventually, we disappeared. Perhaps that is why the strange discovery near King Tutankhamun matters. Not because it automatically proves a hidden chamber. Not because it confirms an ancient curse. Not because it reveals some impossible technology. It matters because it reminds us that history is still unfinished. There are still objects beneath the ground. There are still tombs beneath the sand. There are still inscriptions waiting to be translated. There are still bones waiting to tell their stories. And there are still questions that have survived longer than entire civilizations. Tonight, we may close the book. But the mystery does not end here. Because tomorrow, somewhere in the world, another archaeologist will remove another layer of soil. Another scan will reveal something hidden behind stone. Another ancient object will emerge into the light. And perhaps, for one brief moment, the distance between our world and the ancient world will disappear. We will look at an object created thousands of years ago and realize that the people who made it were not so different from us. They were searching for answers too. They were afraid of the unknown. They wanted to understand death. They wanted to control their future. They wanted their names to survive. And now, thousands of years later, we are still searching for them. That may be the greatest mystery of all. Not what ancient civilizations knew, but how much they knew that we have forgotten. So when you look again at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, do not see only a treasure. See a question. Behind the gold is a young king. Behind the king is a civilization. Behind that civilization is thousands of years of forgotten history. And somewhere beyond what we can currently see, there may be another chapter waiting. A chamber, a name, a forgotten object, a final piece of evidence. Perhaps one day it will be found. And when it is, The story we thought was finished may begin again. Because history is never truly buried. It is only waiting. Waiting beneath the sand. Waiting beneath the stone. Waiting beneath the ruins. Waiting in the darkness. And sometimes, all it takes is one discovery to bring it back into the light.